Number 3. Karina Homer. Karina Homer lived in the village of Skillingrud, Sweden. She had always wanted to travel. When Karina was 20 years old, she won 10,000 crowns from a lottery ticket that she bought at a convenience store. That was about the equivalent of $1,500 US. It was enough money for Homer to start her adventure. She contacted a company that places au pairs in the United States. She was connected with a couple, Frank Rapp and Susan Nitcher, who lived in Dover, a wealthy suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. They had 2 children. Homer cared for the children and cleaned up around the house. She also lived with the family. Frank Rapp was a commercial real estate photographer and his wife was an artist. Rapp had an apartment in South Boston, which he used as an office. On the weekends, Homer was allowed to use it. That was what she was doing on the night of June 21st, 1996. Homer had come to the apartment the night before, and she had to be back at the family's condo the next night. June 21st is during the summer solstice, which is a time of celebration in Sweden. On that night, 20-year-old Karina Homer went out with some friends to some nightclubs in Boston. At the end of the night, they ended up at a bar called Zanzibar. Most of Homer's friends went home before her. She ended up staying until after her last call at Zanzibar. She was last seen outside the bar after it had closed. Later that afternoon, a homeless man was rifling through a dumpster near Fenway Park. He touched a bag, and he realized that there was a human body in the dumpster. So he called the police. In the dumpster, the police found the unclothed upper half body of a young woman. The lower half of her body was not in or around the dumpster. When Frank Rapp and Susan Nitcher heard reports that the dead body of a young woman had been found in a dumpster, Rapp called the city morgue. The remains were identified as 20-year-old Karina Homer. It appeared that she had been strangled to death with a rope and then she was cut in half. Despite extensive searches, the lower part of the body has never been found. The police were baffled by the crime. The police had no idea who would want to hurt the young woman. She had only been in the country for about 3 months. She was quiet and polite, and presumably she hadn't made any enemies. The police talked to Frank Rapp twice, but after the second interview, Rapp said that he had been cleared as a suspect. The police suspected that Homer may have been cut in half because she had been sexually assaulted, and the killer did something with the lower half to make sure that his DNA wasn't identified. Another major problem is that the police didn't have a crime scene to investigate. Crime scenes can yield valuable evidence like fingerprints, hairs, blood, the murder weapon, and etc. Or the crime scene is someone's home or place of business. That helps narrow down the suspect list. But the police have no idea where Homer was killed and dismembered. The only thing that they knew for sure was that the top half of her body was placed in the dumpster. A partial fingerprint was found on the garbage bag which contained the body, but it has never been matched to anyone. The police talked to several people who were with Karina Homer at the nightclub. One of Homer's friends said that she saw her outside the bar after the last call. She was with an older man and they were going to an after party. Another friend said he saw Homer in a gray Mitsubishi with 2 men. He told Homer to get out of the car and come back with a group. One of the men told him to get lost or they would crush his skull. The police talked to some of Homer's friends who lived in Sweden. She supposedly wrote to one friend that she didn't like having to clean up around the family's home. Also, the job wasn't exactly what she expected. In a letter to a different friend, Homer wrote that something terrible had happened. Homer didn't explain what terrible thing had happened, but she told her friend that she would tell her when she returned to Sweden. Homer planned on going home in August. There is some speculation that the terrible thing led to the murder, but no evidence backs up that theory, and no one is even sure what Homer was talking about when she referred to the terrible thing. Unfortunately, the police only have speculation and theories without much evidence to back up anything. They consider the possibility that more than one person was involved in the murder. But after some consideration, the lead detective thinks that only one person was involved in the murder. He does not think that more than one person could keep something like that a secret for over 2.5 decades. It's been nearly 25 years since 20-year-old Karina Homer was brutally murdered. The bottom half of her body has never been found. No one has ever been arrested for her murder. The investigators say that they are haunted by the case. The investigators, along with Karina's family and friends, hope that one day soon, the case will be solved. Number 2. Susan Nason. On September 22, 1969, Susan Nason was 9 years old. Susan lived in Foster City, California, which is on a man-made island in the Bay Area. Foster City had just been established a few years earlier, and a little more than 9,000 people lived in the city. Susan lived with her mother, Margaret, her father, Donald, and her 11-year-old sister, Shirley. She had an all-black dachshund named Snoopy. Susan was just 5 days shy of her 10th birthday. Her parents had invited 11 other girls to go ice skating at a local rink for her birthday. Susan was excited because she had never gone ice skating before. On September 22, 1969, Susan attended school. She came home with an extra pair of shoes that belonged to a girl who lived in the neighborhood. There are conflicting reports as to why Susan had the shoes. Susan either borrowed the shoes or the girl brought them for gym class, forgot them, and Susan brought them home so that she could return them. Nevertheless, Susan asked her mother if she could go take the shoes over to her friend's home. At the time, Margaret was sewing together a dress for Susan's birthday. She decided to let Susan walk over to her friend's house by herself. After all, it was 4 p.m., so it was still daylight, and the girl just lived a block away. Susan dropped off the shoes, but she didn't come home. When Susan didn't return, her family and then her neighbors started searching for Susan. Around 7 p.m., her parents reported her missing. Hundreds of volunteers helped search for her. Officers from every police department in the area and the FBI helped search for the girl. But sadly, no trace of Susan Nason was found. For Margaret and Donald, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that no parents want to go through. Susan's 10th birthday passed without her being found. Weeks and then months went by. On December 2, 1969, 70 days after Susan went missing, a patrolman was walking through an abandoned gravel pit about 8 miles from the family's home. Under a discarded box spring mattress, he found the skeletal remains of a little girl. Based on the clothing, Susan's parents identified the remains as their daughter. The right side of Susan's skull had been crushed. Close to her body was a 3-pound rock that had blood and hair on it. The medical examiner concluded it was the murder weapon. Her hand was also injured, and the stone on her ring on her finger had come out. It's believed that Susan tried to defend herself by putting her hand up. The police believe that the murder happened where the body was found. The logic was it didn't make much sense to transport a murder weapon like a rock to a different location. It could have easily been discarded anywhere if she had been killed elsewhere. Also, the rock seemed like a weapon of convenience. The killer just picked it up and bashed her and then dropped the rock. The people of the Bay Area were shocked by the kidnapping and murder. Unfortunately, the police had very few leads. Several children said that on the day that Susan was kidnapped, they remembered a man in a station wagon who stopped and offered them a ride. But the police were unable to identify the man, and it's not known if he killed Susan. It wasn't long before the case went cold, and it was largely forgotten. The 1960s ended, the 1970s went by, and then the 1980s began. In November 1989, just as the decade was coming to an end, a man who only identified himself as Barry called the police. He said that his wife had some information about murder, but she was reluctant to come forward because the killer was related to her. In that initial conversation, Barry didn't give much other information. He called again 2 more times over the next 2 days. In those phone calls, Barry explained that his wife had memories of someone in her family committing the murder. But she was afraid of him, and she didn't want to reveal his name or her name. 4 days after the initial call, Barry called back, and this time, his wife talked to the police. The woman said that when she was 8 years old, she and the killer picked up Susan Nason. They drove her out to some woods near Half Moon Bay, where Susan's body was later found. Once the killer parked in the woods, he raped Susan in the back seat. Afterward, he took her out of the car. He hit her twice on the head with a rock. He then made her help him put the box spring over Susan's body. He told her that if she ever said anything to anyone about the murder, he would kill her. After the call, a deputy district attorney looked at Susan's case, and he believed that the woman was telling the truth. He talked to the woman on the phone again and told her that he believed her. The woman said that she had never read a newspaper account about the murder. The woman then revealed that her name was Eileen Franklin Lipsker, and she had been a childhood friend of Susan's. The killer was her father, George Franklin. That day, Eileen met with the detectives and gave a more detailed account of the murder. Eileen said that her father was driving her and her sister to school. She also said that it might have been around lunchtime. They came across Susan and offered her a ride. Susan got in the van and her father told her sister to get out. Her father then told her and Susan that they were going to play hooky. They drove to a wooded area near Half Moon Bay where he raped Susan on a mattress in the back of the van. Afterward, he struck her in the head twice with the rock. One time, Susan put up her hand and the rock hit her ring. When that happened, a stone was knocked out of the ring. She helped her father get the mattress out of the back of the van, but she didn't remember what he did with the mattress. It was not the mattress that was used to cover the body. Elaine explained that her mother, Lee Palufo, and her father were divorced. For years, Lee thought that George had killed Susan, and she had even confronted him about it. Eileen was asked if she witnessed the murder, why had it taken her 20 years to come forward. She explained that she only had vague recollections of the murder, but recently they had become more vivid. She also talked about the horrible things that her father allegedly did, like sexually and physically abuse her and her sister. The police wondered if Eileen had some type of vendetta against her father. But nevertheless, they proceeded to investigate George Franklin. The police then interviewed Eileen's sister, Janice. She said that her father was abusive and she had a feeling that he might have killed Susan. She had even called the police 5 years earlier in 1984 and told them about her feeling. On November 28, 1989, 50-year-old George Franklin was arrested. At the time, he was working as a real estate agent. He had been a firefighter until 1981, and then he retired on disability. While George was in jail awaiting trial, Eileen came to visit him. She confronted him and told him to plead guilty to spare their family the embarrassment of a trial. Supposedly, he refused to say anything, and he pointed to a sign that read, "Conversations may be monitored." Eileen took this as an admission of guilt. George Franklin went to trial 11 months after he was arrested. By that time, it came out that Eileen had not had vague memories of the murder that suddenly became more vivid. Instead, she had supposedly completely forgotten about the murder until January 1989. At the time, she had a 5-year-old daughter. One day, her daughter and her friend were playing on the floor in front of her, and she looked into her daughter's eyes. Suddenly, the memory of the murder came back to her. Supposedly, over the next 10 months, the memory became more vivid. There was no physical evidence that connected George to the murder, so Eileen was the star witness. To back up what she said, Dr. Lenore Terre, a psychiatrist with a background in childhood trauma, testified. Terre testified that repressed memories were a real thing. She said that people could bury horrible memories in their mind, keep them hidden for years, even decades, and then suddenly recall them. She said that Eileen was a classic example of someone who suffered repressed memories. Eileen also talked about visiting her father in jail and his refusal to talk when she confronted him. The defense argued that Eileen was making up her story. They noted she was often inconsistent when she repeated the story. She would tell different versions of the story to different people. The defense pointed out that Eileen had signed lucrative TV and book deals that would pay out if her father were to be convicted. Also, the details that Eileen gave did match the details of the murder. Notably, Eileen said that her father kidnapped Susan while they were walking to school, or possibly around lunchtime. But Susan was kidnapped after school. The trial lasted a month. Then the jury deliberated for about 8 hours. They found George Franklin guilty of first-degree murder. It was the first time that anyone had ever been convicted based on recovered memories. In early 1991, there was a sentencing hearing. The judge called George Franklin wicked and depraved. He then sentenced George to life in prison. After the trial, Eileen co-wrote a book, Sins of the Father, and a made-for-TV movie about her alleged experiences, Failed Memories, aired on NBC. She also appeared on many talk shows. An appeals expert started working on George's case shortly after he was convicted. But years went by before any progress was made on the appeals. During those years, more people became skeptical of repressed memories. One of those people was Eileen's mother, Lee Pelufo. She no longer believed her daughter's story. But the most damning was that in August 1984, about 8 months before Eileen said she had the original flashback, she underwent hypnosis for weight loss. She told her brother that during the hypnosis, she witnessed the murder. Also, it was only after she received the hypnosis that she started talking about the murder. California has strict laws regarding testimony obtained through hypnosis. Eileen was informed of this by the district attorney before her father went to trial. So she told her brother not to tell anyone that she had undergone hypnosis. But when he was questioned, he told investigators about the hypnosis. Also, it turned out that everything Eileen said about the murder could be found in newspaper accounts about the murder. She did not have any knowledge about the murder that wasn't printed in the newspaper. The defense tried to argue this in the original trial, but the judge would not allow them. Also, Eileen should not have been able to talk about visiting her father in jail. For all these reasons, in April 1995, the conviction was overturned. The biggest problem was that Eileen had undergone hypnosis. That meant if her father were to be retried, she would not be allowed to testify. On July 3, 1996, it was announced that the district attorney's office would not try George Franklin again, and he was released from jail. He had served about 6 years in prison. Today, it's largely believed that George Franklin was wrongly convicted. Today, the concept of repressed memories is considered highly controversial. Notably, it has been scientifically discredited. Sadly, despite the drama surrounding the murder of 9-year-old Susan Nason, the crime remains unsolved. Unfortunately, in the 5 decades since her murder, no forensic evidence has been saved. So unless someone comes forward with real information, it's likely that the case will never be solved. Number 1. Blair Adams. On July 11, 1996, the police in Knoxville, Tennessee, were called to the parking lot of a hotel that was under construction. 2 construction workers had found the dead body of a man in the parking lot. When the police arrived, they found a truly bizarre crime scene. The dead man's pants were on the ground close to him, and they were inside out. The police said it looked like someone else had pulled his pants off. His shirt had been ripped open. His socks and his shoes were off, and they were found close to his body. His socks were apparently inside out. One of his shoes was under his head. It appears that he used the shoe as a pillow as he was dying. Initially, the police thought that the victim was a vagrant, but there was about $4,000 in American, Canadian, and German currency in his pockets and scattered near his body. Also found near his body was a hotel key card for a hotel that was half a mile away and some keys. Not far from his body was a fanny pack. It was full of valuables like 5 ounces of gold bars, gold and platinum coins, jewelry, more keys, and a pair of sunglasses. In total, it was about $2,000 worth of valuables. An autopsy was performed on the man. He had several cuts on his hands that appeared to be defensive wounds. He had a long cut that was black on one of his hands. It's believed that he got the cut when he was knocked to the pavement and used his hand to break his fall. He had a cut on his forehead that was most likely caused by a blunt object. He was also struck hard in the abdomen, possibly with the blunt object. This was the blow that caused his death. It ruptured his stomach and he died from septic shock. The medical examiner thought that the murder weapon was a club or a crowbar. He may have also been kicked or struck with a vehicle. The man was found at a hotel that was under construction and rebar was at the site. So it's possible that he was beaten with a piece of rebar. Testing was done but the investigators were never definitively able to say what caused the fatal blow. The police identified the man as 31-year-old Blair Adams. Before his murder, Adams lived 3,000 miles away on the other side of the continent in Surrey, British Columbia, Canada. The lead-up to Blair Adams' murder was as bizarre and mysterious as the murder itself. The year before his murder, in 1995, Adams had worked for his father's company on a project near Frankfurt, Germany. His father owned a prefab construction company, and they were working on an assisted living facility. In November 1995, while living in Germany, Adams started dating a woman. At some point, he returned to Canada. In the summer of 1996, Adams was working as a construction foreman for a company in Surrey. He was apparently quite proud of his job, and he was a good worker. But then, during that summer of 1996, Adams started having problems. He couldn't sleep, and he had violent mood swings. Adams told his mother, Sandra Edwards, that something was bothering him, but he wouldn't tell her what the problem was. On Friday, July 5, 1996, 6 days before he was found dead in Knoxville, Adams drained his bank accounts of about $6,000 and took all of his valuables, worth about $2,000, out of his safety deposit box. He then drove to his uncle's home in Courtenay, British Columbia. It takes about 4 hours to drive from Surrey to Courtenay, and it includes a trip on a ferry. His uncle wasn't home, so Adams returned home. On Sunday, July 7th, Adams was driving his Chevrolet Chevette, and he tried to board a ferry in Victoria, British Columbia, that was heading to Seattle, Washington. He was flagged down by U.S. Customs agents because he was a single man traveling with a large amount of money. They thought he might be a drug courier. They asked him if he had a criminal record, and he said he did not, which was a lie. Adams had convictions for assault and drugs. The border agents decided not to admit Adams into the United States. Blair Adams then drove to Vancouver, British Columbia, where he visited a friend. He then traveled to New Westminster, British Columbia, where he visited another friend. He told one of these friends he wanted to cross the border because someone wanted to kill him, but he did not elaborate. Finally, on that Sunday, Adams visited his mother in Surrey. She said he was clearly upset, and he told her that he planned on quitting his job. He also said that he didn't want to stay in his apartment, and he spent the night at his mother's home. The next morning, which was Monday, July 8th, Adams went to his work site. He quit his job, and he collected his last paycheck. A few hours later, Adams purchased a plane ticket for Frankfurt, Germany. But a few hours later, he called the airline and asked for a refund for the ticket. He said he was no longer going to Germany because the person he was going to visit had fallen ill. The police got in contact with Adams' girlfriend in Frankfurt. She said that Adams had not planned on visiting her, and she has no idea why he planned to travel to Frankfurt. Later that night, Adams visited a friend. He told her that someone wanted to hurt him and he needed to get across the border. His friend told him that they were unable to help him. The next morning, which was Tuesday, July 9th, Blair Adams tried to cross the border into Surrey on foot. The border crossing agents noted he had scratches on his hands and his legs. A blue car that had been stolen in Vancouver the day before was found abandoned near the border crossing. Adams matched the description of the car thief. The police didn't have enough evidence to arrest Adams for the car theft, so they allowed him to try to cross the border. But the border agents denied him entry into the United States. Sometime later, one of Adams' friends in Vancouver said that they saw Adams driving a blue car that didn't belong to him. Hours after Adams was turned away at the border, he drove to the Vancouver International Airport. He abandoned his car in the parking lot. Adams had called and confirmed earlier that he could return his plane ticket to Frankfurt, so he did that day at the airport. He then rented a Nissan Altima. Then, for the third time, he tried to cross the border into the United States. This time, he was granted access and he entered Seattle. Adams promptly drove to the Seattle airport and ditched the car. He then purchased a one-way ticket for an overnight flight to Washington, D.C. Once again, this was a strange move for Adams. He paid about $770 for a one-way ticket, but he could have purchased a round-trip ticket for half that price. Nevertheless, he boarded a plane that night and he arrived at Dulles International Airport on the morning of Wednesday, July 10th. In about 24 hours, he would be found dead. At 6:45 a.m., Adams rented a white Toyota Camry. He then started driving southwest, which was odd. Why would he fly all the way east, only to drive back in the direction he came from? Near Troy, Virginia, he backed his car into another man's car. There was only minor damage. The man said that Adams was nice, but he was in a hurry. At 5:30 p.m., Blair Adams was at a gas station in Knoxville, Tennessee. He had problems getting his car started, and he asked the gas station attendant for help. The gas station attendant was easily able to figure out the problem. Adams wasn't using the correct key. He was trying to start the car with a key for a Nissan, and he was driving a Toyota. The attendant told him that he drove there, so he must have the proper key. But Adams swore he didn't have the key. He emptied his pockets, and it appeared that he didn't have it. Believing he had lost the key, Adams tried to contact the rental company, but they were closed for the night. A tow truck took his rental car to a local garage, and Adams was dropped off at a nearby hotel. For about 40 minutes, he paced around the outside of the hotel. He walked in and out of the lobby 5 times. On his 6th trip into the lobby, he finally paid for a room. Adams had paid $100 for the room, and he didn't take his change. The clerk said that Adams was nervous, and he kept thinking someone was going to walk into the lobby looking for him. He was given the card key for his room, and they walked out of the office. But he never went into his room. The front desk clerk called his room several times to let him know that she had his change, but he never answered his phone. After visiting the hotel, Adams ate dinner somewhere. The medical examiner found lettuce, shrimp, and some other type of meat in his stomach. Around 7:30 a.m. the following day, 31-year-old Blair Adams was found dead in a hotel's parking lot. This hotel was about half a mile away from the hotel where he had rented the room. His dead body was surrounded by his money, and he had money in his pockets. Also, his fanny pack full of valuables was untouched. One item that was found was the key to the Toyota Camry that Adams swore he had lost, which is why he ended up staying in Knoxville. So what exactly happened to Blair Adams? The theories abound. One theory is that Adams was involved in a drug deal. But there is no evidence like phone records or correspondence that indicated he was meeting up with anyone. Other people have speculated that Adams owed money to the wrong people. But there are several problems with this theory. The first is that Adams had several $1,000s in his bank accounts. It is assumed he would have used this money before he borrowed money from someone like a loan shark. If he was in debt to someone dangerous, why hadn't he handed over the money he did have? Also, illegal debt collectors don't like to kill their debtors because they can't collect any more money if they kill them. So they would rather threaten or injure the debtor. Possibly they could kill someone close to the debtor. Also, if Adams was killed over a debt, why didn't the killer steal any of the money or valuables that he had on him? And it simply doesn't make sense that a loan shark would chase Adams from Surrey, British Columbia to Washington, D.C., then follow him to Knoxville, Tennessee to kill him and not take as much money and valuables as they could. So the police are very doubtful that he was killed over a financial debt. Before Adams left British Columbia, he told several friends that people wanted him dead. He even told a few friends who those people were. In 1995, Adams worked for his father's company in Germany. Adams said that people coming back from Germany were the ones who wanted to hurt him. But he didn't identify anyone specifically or explain why they wanted to hurt him. The police are not convinced that anyone was after Adams. They think that he was delusional. One theory is that Adams was on drugs and alcohol, and this caused him to act paranoid. After all, in the past, Adams did have problems with drugs and alcohol. But the autopsy revealed he had no drugs or alcohol in his system. Adams also didn't have a history of mental illness. He had never been diagnosed with a mental disorder. Also, Adams was paranoid about being murdered, and then he was murdered. To quote Joseph Heller in Catch-22, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't after you. So was Blair Adams delusional, or was someone really after him? It's quite possible that Adams' paranoia and his murder are completely unrelated. He could have just happened to be paranoid, and then he was killed in Knoxville by someone unrelated to his paranoia. For example, there were signs that Adams had been sexually assaulted, but the police weren't sure if the assault actually happened because no DNA was left behind. So Adams could have been killed by a local he had not met before that night during the commission of a sex crime. Adams' mother told the police that her son had been physically intimate with a male roommate sometime before his death. So perhaps his murder was the result of a sexual encounter with a man that went deadly wrong. Another possibility is that Adams met with a sex worker and either she or her pimp killed him. Perhaps the sex worker and her pimp planned on robbing Adams, but then they got scared and didn't do it. Or things got out of hand during the robbery, they panicked and fled the scene without stealing anything. One investigator believes that this is what happened. He thinks that Adams was involved in a sex act in a car. He was struck in the head and he fell out of the car. Then he was possibly struck by the car as the person drove away. As he fell to the ground, he put out his hand to break the fall, and this is how the black cut got on his hand. When he was struck by the car, his stomach was ruptured and he died within minutes. However, not everyone is convinced that this is what happened. This includes other investigators on the case. In 2017, the Knoxville News Sentinel published an article about Blair Adams' bizarre murder. They interviewed his mother, Sandra Edwards, and she gave a new detail that she never told the police. She said that her son was traveling to Atlanta, Georgia to see the Summer Olympics. The Olympics opened 8 days after his body was found. Adams' mother then hung up the phone without giving any further explanation. She also didn't explain to the reporter why she didn't tell the police he was going to the Olympics. The reporter called back several times, but most of his calls went unanswered. One time that he called, Edward's husband answered the phone. He said that he wasn't going to open that can of worms again, and the chances of solving the case were remote as hell. The police have one piece of physical evidence. It is a long strand of hair that was found in Adam's hand. The hair does not belong to Adams. It may be possible to get DNA from the hair. For years, the only way to get DNA from a strand of hair is if the hair had a root. But in September 2019, it was announced that DNA could be extracted from rootless hair. Also, in the last several years, we've seen the rise of genetic genealogy, which has identified dozens of killers in cold cases. So as long as the strand of hair has been properly preserved, it may just be a matter of time before investigators find out who the strand of hair belongs to. It may belong to the killer, or it could lead to the break that the case needs. The police are hoping that someone will come forward with information regarding the murder. As of right now, after nearly 25 years, the murder of Blair Adams remains cold. Number 3. Arlene Hoffman. As 1994 was coming to an end, Arlene Hoffman was 57 years old. She was living in a townhouse in Laguna Niguel, California. Everyone who knew Arlene said she was a dynamic woman. One of Arlene's friends told a reporter who was writing a profile on her that only someone like Mark Twain could capture Arlene's essence in words. Clearly, we're not in the same league as Mark Twain, but this is what is known about Arlene Hoffman. Arlene was born and raised in New Jersey. Shortly after high school, she married a man named Joel. After getting married, they relocated to California. When Arlene was 24, she got a job as a secretary at Norton Simon Incorporated. Norton Simon was an American industrialist who started Velveeta Foods, which later became Hunt's. At the time, Simon was one of the richest men in America. Arlene was eventually promoted to the position of executive secretary for the president of the company. The president moved to New York, and he asked Arlene to relocate and continue to be his secretary. But Arlene declined the offer. Instead, she became the personal secretary to Norton Simon. While Arlene worked for one of the richest men in America, she and Joel had financial problems. When Arlene was 26, they filed for bankruptcy. It's believed that the money problems stemmed from setbacks Joel had at his butcher shop. In 1970, Arlene got a job as a secretary to an attorney who was running for Congress. He ultimately wasn't elected. In 1973, Arlene worked on a campaign for a former Speaker of the California State Assembly who was running for mayor of Los Angeles. The former Speaker did not win the election. In 1972, Arlene started working at a political consulting firm run by a man named Fred Harbour. She worked there for just over 2 years. Then in June 1975, Harbour went missing while boating off the coast of Baja California. His body has never been found. In 1975, Arlene's husband, Joel, was appointed to the position of probate referee. Probate referees appraise estate assets. It's believed that one of Arlene's political connections got him the job. Arlene also worked for a hospital run by Dr. Louis Sella. Sella was known for his powerful political connections, and he was referred to as a kingmaker. At one time, he was the largest contributor to political campaigns in California. Sella was accused of making out fake patients and then billing California's Medicaid program as if he had treated them. He then funneled that money into political campaigns. In 1976, Arlene testified in front of the grand jury regarding the embezzlement. Sella ended up being convicted of tax evasion, embezzlement, and conspiracy, and he served 31 months in a federal prison. After working at the hospital, Arlene continued to work as Joel's assistant and his office manager until 1991. Besides being a probate referee, Joel also worked as a consultant. Then, in 1992, Joel found out he had 2 terminal illnesses and he was unable to work. Arlene struggled to pay the bills and she had to file for bankruptcy again in October 1993. She kept the bankruptcy a secret from her dying husband. Joel passed away in March 1994. After Joel died, Arlene collected $510,000 in life insurance payouts. She then moved into the townhouse in Laguna Niguel, which was owned by her sister and her brother-in-law. Arlene had no biological children, but when she was in her 40s, she adopted a teenage boy. The mother was a friend of hers, and the boy apparently came from a rough background. In the autumn of 1994, months after her husband's death, Arlene was working on the campaign of Jim Silva, who was running for the Orange County Board of Supervisors. Silva won the election, and he hired Arlene to be his personal secretary. On December 29, 1994, Arlene went out shopping for some clothes for work. She then went home. At around 7 p.m., Arlene called her sister. The next morning, Arlene didn't show up for work. Everyone thought that this was odd because it was Jim Silva's first staff meeting and Arlene was looking forward to it. She planned on bringing donuts. At the end of the business day, no one had heard from Arlene, so her boss, Jim Silva, called the police and asked them to do a welfare check. Officers arrived at the townhouse and found the front door unlocked. They let themselves in to Arlene's home. They found the 57-year-old dead in the foyer. She had been shot in the chest with a hunting arrow. The arrow either went through her body or was pulled out by the killer. The arrow was not found at the crime scene. It is believed that the arrow was shot from a bow, a spear gun, or a crossbow. The medical examiner thought that Arlene was killed sometime between 7:30 p.m., about half an hour after she called her sister, and 7:30 the next morning. Besides Arlene's dead body lying in the foyer, nothing else was out of place. The house had not been ransacked and there were no signs of disarray. Also, nothing had been stolen. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry. One interesting thing that the police noted was that the arrow entered Arlene's body on a downward angle. The police suspected that the killer was standing above her on her staircase when he or she fired the arrow. The police were at a loss as to who would have wanted to kill Arlene Hoffman. She had not been sexually assaulted and nothing appeared to be stolen. The police considered the possibility that she was killed because of her work or political connections, but that line of investigation did not yield a suspect. Another possibility was that Arlene owed money to the wrong people. But since nothing was stolen, the police do not think that Arlene was murdered over money. The police suspected that since there was no forced entry or a break-in, Arlene knew her killer. The police also investigated her friends and family. Once again, they did not find any viable suspects. They were able to rule out Arlene's adopted son as the killer. He received most of her six-figure estate. He put up a $25,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. But no one came forward with a viable lead. Over 25 years later, the murder of 57-year-old Arlene Hoffman is considered cold. Number 2. Sylvia Lung. In the 1980s, Lawrence Lung worked for Hong Kong's immigration department. While he worked for the department, he secured Canadian citizenships for himself, his wife, Kitty, their son, Hugo, and their daughter, Sylvia. He did not go through the usual channels to get these citizenships. In 1989, Lawrence was promoted to Director of Immigration. That same year, the Lung family moved into an upscale apartment in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Although his family lived in Canada, Lawrence still held his position as Director of Immigration in Hong Kong. In 1993, Lawrence's daughter, Sylvia, was 22 years old. She was attending the BC Institute of Technology, where she was studying financial management. The campus is in the city of Burnaby, which is in the Vancouver metropolitan area. At around 7:30 p.m. on January 24, 1993, Sylvia was found bleeding to death in one of the parking lots on campus. An arrow from a crossbow was lodged in her left shoulder. Sylvia was rushed to the hospital, but sadly, she was pronounced dead on arrival. The arrow had cut an artery in her shoulder and she bled to death. Before Sylvia's murder, her family was the victim of a series of arson attacks. Nearly 4 months earlier, on August 28, 1998, someone or several people broke into their home in Vancouver. They started a fire in the bedroom of Sylvia's brother, Hugo. They also started another fire in the basement rec room. An accelerant was used in the fire. No one was at home when the fires were started. In total, there was $115,000 in damage. After the fire, while construction was being done on the apartment, Hugo moved out and he lived with some friends. Just over 2 months later, on November 2nd, he was still living with some friends. On that night, his car was parked outside of their home. Someone set it on fire. Then, 2 nights later, a fire was started in the stairwell of the Lungs building. The fire caused $7,500 in damage. Once again, an accelerant was used. About 2.5 months later, Sylvia was killed. A detective was convinced that the fires and the murder were connected. One of the first people the police investigated was a former boyfriend of Sylvia's, but they found no evidence to connect him to the murder or the fires. 9 months after the murder, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrested a man in Calgary, Alberta. Calgary is about 600 miles from Vancouver. The man was arrested after he blackmailed families in Calgary. He was also seen around the city firing a crossbow, but the police were able to clear the man as a suspect. A detective who worked on the case thought that the arson attacks and the murder were committed by professionals. So the police investigated to see if the Triads, a Chinese-based transnational crime syndicate, was responsible for any of the crimes. But once again, no charges were laid regarding the murder of Sylvia Lung. There was also some speculation that Sylvia's murder had something to do with her father's position as the Director of Immigration for Hong Kong. Nearly 3.5 years after Sylvia's murder, her father, Lawrence, was forced to resign from his position. This was shocking because it was the lead up to the British handover of Hong Kong to the Chinese. The reason he was forced to resign was not made public at the time. Without an official explanation, it led to a lot of speculation about why Lawrence was forced out. The leading rumor was that Lawrence was setting up passports for Chinese dissidents, but he was also feeding the Chinese government information about the dissidents. In 2008, Lawrence Long died at the age of 67 without seeing someone arrested for the murder of his daughter. In 2019, 18 files regarding Lawrence's time as Director of Immigration were made public. The files contain an explanation for why he was forced to resign. Lawrence had a close friend who was involved in organized crime in Hong Kong and overseas. The man was involved in money laundering in several countries. When Lawrence was questioned about the man, he was reluctant to talk about him, but he did admit that they were close friends. Lawrence was also investigated over a check he received in May 1993 for 750,000 Hong Kong dollars, which was equivalent to about 100,000 US dollars. A person who reviewed the financial transaction thought that the money came from a drug syndicate. Lawrence claimed that the check was the profit from a company in Singapore that he had invested in. There wasn't any further investigation into the check, but the fact that Lawrence was close friends with a man who was involved in money laundering and organized crime was enough to force him to resign. It's important to note that only 18 files regarding Lawrence's time as Director of Immigration were released. 7 other files have not been released because they have been labeled confidential. The content of those files will not be made public until 2047. As of right now, the murder of Sylvia Lung remains unsolved and is considered cold. If her father's actions, relationships, or his position as Director of Immigration had anything to do with her brutal murder, we may not know for another 27 years. Number 1. Patricia Parsons. Patricia Parsons lived in Frion Barnet, which is a suburb in the London, England borough of Barnet. In 1990, her house was worth £500,000. Accounting for inflation, that is £1.1 million or 1.5 million US dollars in 2020. This was just one of 3 homes she owned. Parsons' official job was a masseuse, but the real source of her income was her work as an escort. Supposedly, Parsons entertained prominent people, including judges, lawyers, and TV presenters. On the night of June 23, 1990, Parsons was supposed to meet her boyfriend of 2 years at his restaurant. That evening, he was hosting a party at the restaurant. Parsons had lent him money to open the restaurant, but Parsons never arrived at the restaurant. The next day, at around noon, Parsons' car was found parked beside a country road near Epping Forest. Epping Forest is an ancient woodland that is on the border of London and Essex. Inside the car was the dead body of 42-year-old Patricia Parsons. She had been shot 3 times in the head and the neck with arrows from a high-powered crossbow. The police talked to Parsons' neighbors, and several of them noticed odd things that happened on the day she was murdered. One neighbor was driving down the same country road where her car was found around 1:30 p.m. Near the spot where Parsons' car would be found nearly 24 hours later, she saw 2 cars parked on the opposite sides of the road. 2 men were loitering around the cars. At about 6:30 p.m., she was driving on the same road and she noticed that the men were still there. Around 5 p.m., Parsons was home and her car was parked in her driveway. One of her neighbors saw a nice black car pull into the driveway, but the driver didn't get out of the car. He just nodded at the house, then backed out of the driveway and drove off. At about 7:30 p.m., Parsons left her home and then came back at about 8 p.m. Her boyfriend called her shortly after she got home. Parsons told him that she had big news to share, but she did not want to tell him what it was over the phone. He asked her if the news was good or bad, and she said it was good news. Another one of Parsons' neighbors was home that night watching a World Cup game. At around 8:30, he heard a man shouting in Parsons' home. Minutes later, he heard Parsons' door slam shut. Then he saw Parsons and a man walk to Parsons' car. The man got into the driver's seat and Parsons got into the passenger seat. Then they drove off. Parsons' boyfriend called her at home at 9:15, but no one answered. The police had a team of 6 detectives work on the case, but it wasn't long before the case went cold. In 2003, the case was reviewed and DNA testing was done. However, it did not lead to an arrest. The police continued to investigate the murder. In February 2007, 17 years after Parsons was killed, the police arrested a 58-year-old man in connection with the murder. He was not arrested because of DNA evidence, but instead the police found the man using what they called traditional inquiry methods. They questioned the man for 5 hours, and he refused to answer their questions. He was ultimately released, and he was never charged again. No one else has been arrested in connection with Parsons' murder. The police thought that Patricia Parsons might have been killed to keep her quiet. There were rumors that she was going to talk about her clientele with a reporter from a newspaper. Parsons kept a diary that was either blue or black, and it contained her list of clients. The list contained 200 names, and some of them were supposedly very prominent people. After she was killed, the diary was nowhere to be found, and it has never been located. However, many people do not believe this is why she was killed. One reason is that Parsons was already wealthy. Also, her clients paid her well to be discreet, so she did not have much to gain by going public. Another theory is that Parsons was killed by a professional hitman with connections to organized crime. 6 months before she was killed, there was a double homicide that took place about 2 miles from where her body was found. 39-year-old Terry Gooderham was an accountant and auditor for several pubs. In December 1989, he was dating 2 women. One of them was 32-year-old Maxine Arnold. Arnold possibly knew that Gooderham was dating the other woman. On December 23, 1989, Gooderham and Arnold were found dead in his car. The car was parked near Ebbing Forest, about 2 miles from where Patricia Parsons was found dead in her car. Arnold and Gooderham had been shot in the back of the head with a shotgun. The police went to Arnold's apartment and found the lights on, and her purse was there. It is thought that the killer forced the couple to leave the apartment, where someone set up a meeting between them and the killer. Then the killer forced them to drive to the spot near Ebbing Forest where he or she shot them. It's also believed that Gooderham was the target and Arnold was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. There are several theories about why the couple was killed. One was that Gooderham was dating a third woman and she killed them or had them killed. However, the police never uncovered any evidence to back up this theory. Another possibility is that Gooderham discovered some fraud during his work as an accountant and auditor for pubs. This theory has a bit more substance. In December 2019, a now retired detective talked to the tabloid, The Mirror. He chose to remain anonymous. According to official Scotland Yard documents, in the days after the murder of the couple, there were 4 suspects, and they were all connected to organized crime syndicates. The detectives said that no arrests were made because the suspects were protected by corrupt police officers. The detective claimed that he talked to an informant, and the informant told him that Gooderham had uncovered a scam. Gangsters were threatening pub owners and taking control of the pubs. The ringleader of the scam was an associate of twin brother gangsters Ronnie and Reggie Cray. In March 1969, the Cray brothers were convicted of murder and they were sentenced to life in prison. The associate, who was not identified, was not arrested with the brothers, and he continued to be involved in criminal activity. There is speculation that the gangster ordered a hitman named Jimmy Moody to kill Gooderham to silence him. Moody was an enforcer and hitman for several crime syndicates over 4 decades. In December 1980, Moody escaped from a prison in inner South London. He was awaiting trial for armed robbery. He remained on the lam until June 1st, 1993. That's when the 52-year-old hitman was shot to death in a pub in East London. Moody is supposedly the prime suspect in the murder of Terry Gooderham and Maxine Arnold. But did he have anything to do with the murder of Patricia Parsons? Some people believe so because of the similarities between the murder of the couple and Parsons' murder. They were all driven to an area outside of Ebbing Forest. Their bodies were found about 2 miles from each other. Their murders happened within 6 months of each other. They were all shot to death in their cars, albeit Gooderham and Arnold were killed with a shotgun and Parsons was killed with a crossbow. The police also said that the murders had the hallmarks of a professional hit. While there are a lot of theories, it's not known for sure if one killer was responsible for all 3 murders. It is also not known for sure who killed them, and their cases are considered cold. Number 3. Sarah Powell. At around 9:30 on the morning of November 16, 1993, a strange phone call came into a post office in Clear Lake, which is a city in the greater Houston area. The caller was a girl who sounded like she was in her early teens. The girl said she didn't know who she was or where she was. She said she was tied up and she was in a pink room that had teddy bears in it. The girl said she managed to get the phone off the hook with her mouth. She hit redial with her tongue and it called the post office. One of the post office employees, Debbie Powell, was sure that the caller was her 14-year-old daughter, Sarah Powell. Sarah had stayed home from school that day because she was sick. Debbie asked a coworker to call the police and then she raced home. When Debbie got to her home, police officers were waiting for her. She opened the front door and entered the house with some police officers. The house had been completely ransacked. Debbie raced upstairs to Sarah's room. Sarah was laying hogtied on the floor of her bedroom. When Debbie moved close to her daughter started screaming. Sarah claimed she did not know who her mother was. She also pleaded with her mother not to hurt her. An officer had to lead Debbie away from Sarah because Sarah was so upset. An officer got Sarah out of her bindings and he asked her what happened. Sarah said she did not remember being tied up. In fact, she said she couldn't even remember who she was. Sarah was shown photographs of her family and her friends, and she said she didn't recognize them, and she did not recognize her own home. The police thought that the crime scene looked odd. They did not find any signs of a break-in or forced entry. Also, while the house had been thoroughly ransacked, nothing had been stolen. What the police found most troubling was that it was a rainy day, but they did not find any shoe or boot prints inside the house. The police thought that Sarah might have been involved in the ransacking of her home. They also were not convinced that she had lost all her memories. However, they could not explain why she would have wanted to trash her own home. Days after the incident, Sarah's memories still had not returned. Debbie initially thought that Sarah had been threatened to keep quiet, so that was why she was telling the police she didn't remember anything. Debbie assumed that after the police left, Sarah would drop the act and tell her what happened. But that did not happen. Debbie even tried to trick Sarah to see if it was an act, but it didn't work. Sarah had supposedly forgotten how to do basic things like brush her teeth, write her name, and tie her shoes. She apparently had to relearn these skills. Her family tried to stir her memories with photographs, but Sarah continued to claim that she didn't recognize anyone who was in her life. Debbie said her daughter was a shell of her former self. She said it was as if someone had kidnapped her daughter. Sarah's body was there, but her mind was not. After 2 months, Sarah had relearned the basic skills she had supposedly forgotten. One day, Sarah and Debbie were walking on the grounds of the school that Sarah attended. Suddenly, Sarah fell to the ground and started convulsing. Debbie was sure it was a seizure. When Sarah stopped convulsing, she said, "I didn't let them in." Sarah claimed because of the seizure, some of her memories from that morning had come back to her. Sarah said that at around 8:30 a.m., she put the dog in the laundry room. Then she heard a loud noise come from the second floor. She ran to the second floor and saw 2 men trying to force open her bedroom window. She called her mother's work, but the line was busy, so she hung up. Sarah rushed downstairs, and she was planning on going out through the front door. The door had a double padlock, and keys were needed to open it. Sarah couldn't find her keys, so she couldn't get out the front door. Then the sounds from upstairs stopped. Slowly, Sarah crept back upstairs, and she didn't see the men at her window. Then suddenly, she was grabbed from behind and forced onto the bed. One of the men put a pillow over her head. Sarah struggled at first, but then stopped moving when she couldn't breathe. Then the man removed the pillow from her head. After he did, Sarah sat up and looked at the 2 men. One was wearing a mask, and the other one was wearing a stocking over his head. The man who was wearing the mask was smaller than the man who was wearing the stocking. The man wearing the stocking was armed with a gun. Sarah said that the man hit her in the head with the butt of the pistol. She then blacked out. Sarah said that was all she remembered. Then, a short time later, Sarah had another seizure, and she said that more memories came back to her. She said that she was alone in the bedroom with the smaller man who was wearing the mask. He told her to stay calm, and if she did what she was told to do, she wouldn't get hurt. Then the larger man came back into the room, and he was angry that they were talking. Sarah said that the man aimed the gun at her head and then he pulled the trigger. But, for whatever reason, the gun didn't fire. The larger man then ordered the smaller man to tie up Sarah, and he did. While Sarah was being tied up, the larger man trashed the house. Sarah said that 2 women were with them. She said she could hear the women talking downstairs. Then the larger man and the 2 women came upstairs and joined the smaller man in Sarah's bedroom. They all exited through Sarah's bedroom window. After they left, Sarah fainted. When she came to, she couldn't remember anything about her past, not even her own name. Using her mouth, she got the phone off the hook. But she did not know what number to call because she couldn't remember anything. So she hit redial. The last number she had called was the post office where her mother worked. She had called when the men were supposedly trying to break in, but she got busy signal. The police were not convinced by Sarah's story of a home invasion. They asked Sarah if she would be hypnotized, and she agreed. Under hypnosis, Sarah told the same story about the home invasion. But the police were still unconvinced. They thought there were simply too many problems with the apparent crime scene. There was no evidence that anyone, let alone 4 people, broke in. The police found no strange fingerprints, and there were no boot or shoe prints, even though it was raining that day. Also, why would 4 people break into a suburban home on a weekday morning, ransack it, but steal nothing? People who believe Sarah counter, why would she ransack her own home and then fake amnesia for several months? The chief of psychology at Texas Children's Hospital said that Sarah could have suffered a unique type of amnesia. During the home invasion, she was suffocated and she was struck in the head. Also, the home invasion would have been a traumatic experience. Together, these elements could have caused the amnesia. In total, Sarah had 9 seizures, and she supposedly regained all her memories. Although the police weren't convinced that there really was a home invasion, they had Sarah sit down with a sketch artist. She described what the large, muscular man may have looked like without the stocking on his head. She said he was about 5'10", and he was in his 30s or 40s. She also noticed that on his right arm, he had a tattoo in blue ink of a cobra. The man and his associates, if they exist, have never been identified. Sarah Powell grew up and got married. In 2002, she was going by the name Sarah Estes, and she had 2 children. Sarah said that she suffers from depression because she's worried she'll lose her memory again at any time. Number 2. Irma Plasix. Irma and Gregor Plasix grew up across the road from each other in a small town in Hungary. They were wed in 1947. A year later, Irma gave birth to a daughter. 8 years later, she gave birth to a second daughter. In 1956, the same year that their second daughter was born, the Hungarian Revolution began. Irma convinced Gregor that they should leave all their possessions and flee the country. They got out of Hungary the day before the borders closed. The family eventually made their way to Australia. They struggled at first because they didn't speak English and they didn't know anyone in the country. They bought a piece of land and with their own hands, they built a house. They ended up selling that house, and they purchased another plot of land. Once again, they built a house and then sold it. In 1962, they purchased some land in Red Hill, which is a suburb of Canberra, Australian Capital Territory. They built what they hoped would be their forever home. They raised their daughters in the home. Their 2 daughters went on to get married, and between them, they had 5 boys. Irma and Gregor loved being grandparents. In 1997, a person or persons broke into their home. Irma and Gregor didn't trust banks, so they kept a lot of cash in their home. The thief, or thieves, managed to steal $100,000 plus some jewelry. No arrests were made in the break-in. The next year, Irma came home and found 2 men wearing balaclavas in her garage. One of the men attacked her, and she managed to pull off his balaclava. When she did, he let her go, but he swore he'd be back. Then he and his partner ran off into the darkness of the night. The ordeal terrified Irma. She and Gregor decided to sell their beloved home, and they moved to McKellar, which is a different suburb of Canberra that was about 12 miles from their old home. They spent a lot of money on security, but sadly, it did not help them. At about 9:30 p.m. on November 6, 1999, as Gregor and Irma were watching television, 2 men wearing balaclavas broke into their home. They tied up the elderly couple and beat them severely. The home invaders demanded to know where the money was. Over 2 hours, they ransacked the house and tortured the grandparents. Then the 2 men left with some money and some jewelry. When they were gone, Gregor was able to free himself. He got to a phone and called for help. Sadly, it was too late for 72-year-old Irma. She died at the scene. Gregor, who was 73, was hospitalized and eventually recovered. The police investigated the murder, and forensic experts found DNA from one of the home invaders. But the DNA did not lead to an arrest. Several years after Irma was killed, Gregor died. His family said that some of his final thoughts were that he failed as a husband and as a protector. In August 2012, nearly 13 years after the murder, the police announced that they thought that they had a major break in the case. They said that they were looking for 5 young men who broke into a mini golf course in 2010. They even released a video of the break-in. But the police did not explain how the break-in was connected to Irma's murder. They didn't explain the connection until 2 years later. It turned out that DNA had been found at the break-in at the golf course. DNA testing was done, and it was thought that the DNA found at the mini golf course belonged to the son of one of the men who had killed Irma. But then, 11 months later, the police ruled out the DNA connection because an error had been made. A detective said that familial DNA was a new technology, and it was the first time it was used in Australian Capital Territory. While there was an error in that testing, another DNA test was done, and it confirmed something that the police had always suspected. The DNA found at Irma's murder scene was compared to DNA found at the 1998 break-in. It was a match. The police suspected that the break-ins in 1997 and 1998 were connected to the deadly home invasion in 1999. Now they have proof that at least one man broke into the couple's home twice. There is currently a reward of $500,000 for information that leads to an arrest in the case. Irma's family says that they are frustrated by the lack of progress on the case, and they are sick of getting nothing but silence from the police. Irma's family thinks that the DNA will lead to an arrest. The family hopes that the case will be solved using forensic genealogy, which was the process that was used to identify the Golden State Killer. If the police commission a forensic genealogical investigation, it may just be a matter of time before an arrest is made. Number 1. The Wonderland Murders. On July 1st, 1981, some movers were moving furniture into the house next door to 8763 Wonderland Avenue in the Laurel Canyon area of Los Angeles, California. The movers heard some moaning coming from the house, so they went to investigate. The interior of the house was splattered with blood. The moaning they heard was coming from 29-year-old Susan Lanius. She had been savagely beaten in the head. The movers called 911 and first responders arrived on the scene. Susan was taken to the hospital. The police looked around the rest of the house. The couple who were leasing the home, 44-year-old Billy Deverell and 46-year-old Joy Miller, were found in their bed. Both were deceased. Susan and her husband, 37-year-old Ron Lanius, were house guests. Ron was also found dead in the home. A fourth dead body was found in the home. She was 22-year-old Barbara Richardson. They had all been savagely beaten to death. It is believed that they were killed with iron pipes and at least one baseball bat. Several officers said that the murders were more gruesome than the murders committed by the followers of Charles Manson 12 years earlier. Susan Lanius would go on to survive her injuries, but she was left with brain damage and she had no memory of that night. 3 of the 5 people who were attacked that night were members of a cocaine trafficking gang called the Wonderland Gang. They were Billy Deverell, Joy Miller, and Ron Lanius. Neither Susan Lanius nor Barbara Richardson were members of the gang. Susan was married to Ron, and Barbara was dating a gang member named David Lynn, who was not in the house that night. The 5th and final member of the gang was a man named Tracy McCourt. McCourt was at his own home on the night of the home invasion. At the crime scene, the police found what they thought was a solid piece of evidence. It was a bloody palm print. It was found on the railing of the bed where Ron had died. The police ran the print and they came up with a match. The palm print belonged to adult film star John C. Holmes. John had starred in dozens of hardcore adult movies. Often, his character's name was Johnny Wad. At the time of the murders, John had a severe cocaine addiction. Incidentally, John had been arrested 10 days after the mass murder. He had previously been convicted of grand theft, but he did not appear for his sentencing hearing. Even though he had jumped bond, after he was arrested, he was released on his own accord. After that, he vanished. About 5 months later, the authorities learned that John Holmes was hiding out in Miami, Florida. On December 4th, 1981, John was arrested without incident. John was interviewed by a detective named Frank Tomlinson. John told Detective Tomlinson that the murders were ordered by a man named Eddie Nash. Nash was born at Del Nazarel in British Palestine in April 1929. He emigrated to the United States in the early 1950s. Supposedly, he only had $7 when he arrived in the United States. Nash worked hard, and by the 1970s, he was a very wealthy man. He owned several nightclubs and strip clubs in Los Angeles. John told Detective Tomlinson that the day before the murders, the Wonderland Gang had performed a home invasion of their own. The victim of the home invasion was Eddie Nash. They stole some money, property, and a lot of cocaine. John said that Nash knew he was involved in the home invasion and he demanded to know who did it. John said he didn't want to tell him, but Nash threatened him and his family. So John told him it was the Wonderland Gang. John said that Nash was furious and he ordered him to take 3 men to the gang's house. John claimed he was then forced to watch as they were all beat to death. Besides mentioning Eddie Nash, John refused to say who was involved in the murder. Nash and his bodyguard, Gregory Diles, both denied being involved in the Wonderland murders. Also, no physical evidence connected them to the murders. John Holmes was eventually charged with all 4 murders himself. He went to trial in June 1982, nearly a year after the murders. The main piece of evidence against him was the bloody palm print that was found on the railing of the bed. The other evidence was the testimony of Detective Frank Tomlinson, who said that John had confessed to taking the killers to the house and being there while the murders happened. Tomlinson even testified that the murders were ordered by Eddie Nash. The prosecution acknowledged that Nash was probably the mastermind, but they maintained that John Holmes was an integral person in the massacre. John's lawyer contended that John had nothing to do with the Wonderland murders and he knew nothing about them. John was addicted to cocaine, so he visited the house in Wonderland often. His lawyer said he could have left his palm print there at any time. The jury ended up acquitting John Holmes of all charges. After his trial, John told reporters that he was planning on getting back into acting. And he did just that, but most of the time it was just cameo roles. In November 1986, John Holmes was diagnosed as HIV positive. After the diagnosis, he made 2 more hardcore adult films. John did not reveal to his co-stars that he was HIV positive and he had unprotected sex with them. Luckily, none of his co-stars contracted HIV. Months later, when it became obvious that John was seriously ill, he told people he had colon cancer. On March 13, 1988, John Holmes died of complications from AIDS. He was 43 years old. Weeks after John died, his first wife, Sharon Holmes, whom he had been married to for 20 years, sat down for an interview with the Los Angeles Times. Sharon said that John would often disappear from her life, but he'd always come back to her. She said that 3 weeks after the Wonderland murders, John paid her a visit. He said that he used to buy drugs from the Wonderland Gang. He would also take property that the gang had stolen to Eddie Nash's home and exchange it for drugs. Then, the Wonderland gang decided to rob Nash. John went over to Nash's home earlier that day, and he left his sliding door unlocked. That evening, Ron Lanius, Billy Deverell, David Lynn, and Tracy McCord went to Nash's home. McCord was the driver, and the three other men entered Nash's home through the sliding door. Inside, they held Nash and his bodyguard, Gregory Dials, at gunpoint. At some point during the home invasion, Dials was shot, but he was not too seriously injured. The Wonderland gang got away with money, drugs, and some property. John said that the day after the home invasion, a person who knew Nash saw him walking around while he was wearing a piece of Nash's jewelry. When John got back to his car, two armed men were waiting for him. They got him to follow them to Nash's home. When John got there, Nash was going through his address book. John said that Nash was threatening to kill his family if he didn't tell him who robbed him. John told him it was the Wonderland gang. John said that Nash forced him to take three of his men to the gang's home. When they got there, John used the intercom and he was buzzed into the home. Nash's three henchmen followed him into the house. Once they were in the house, John said that one of Nash's men made him stand up against a wall, and then the man held a gun to his head. The other two men then proceeded to bludgeon everyone in the home. John claimed he heard a lot of screaming. John swore he didn't hurt anyone himself. Sharon Holmes said that she believes, at the very least, John was in the home when the murders were committed. As for Eddie Nash, he was arrested in November 1981, 5 months after the Wonderland murders. He was arrested after the police performed a raid on his home that was unrelated to the murders. Nash's house was raided because 17 days earlier, one of his employees overdosed on drugs, and the police were sure he had gotten the drugs from Nash. During the raid, the police found 2 pounds of cocaine with a reported street value of $1 million. In October 1982, just over 3 months after John Holmes was acquitted of murder, Nash was found guilty of possession with intent to sell. A month later, he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. But he only served about 2 years. A judge ended up releasing him early, citing health reasons. Nash supposedly told people that he had bribed the judge to get released. Then in September 1988, Nash and his bodyguard, Gregory Dials, were arrested and charged with the Wonderland murders. Their arrest stemmed from the fact that a man named Scott Thorson approached the police with information about the murders, which happened 7 years earlier. Thorson had been the romantic partner of famed entertainer Liberace from 1977 to 1982. Thorson approached the police after he had been convicted of a drug-related armed robbery and he was awaiting sentencing. Thorson said he used to be a friend of Eddie Nash's and he used to buy drugs from him. He said that he was at Nash's home on the day after he was robbed, which was hours before the Wonderland murders. Nash was furious and he was ranting that he would kill John Holmes and his family. Thorson also said that Nash wanted to teach the people who robbed him a lesson and he would bring them to their knees. Thorson said that later, Nash confessed to him that he had ordered the murders. Nash said that the murders got out of hand. Nash and Dials were tried separately. Nash went to trial first in May 1990. John Holmes had died a couple years earlier, so the only person who testified against Nash was Scott Thorson. There was no physical evidence. The trial ended in a mistrial because the jury was deadlocked. 11 of the jurors had voted to convict, and one juror had voted to acquit. A couple weeks later, Dials went to trial. His trial also ended in a mistrial because of a deadlocked jury. 10 jurors had voted to acquit, and 2 voted to convict. Both men went to trial again in early 1981. This time, they were tried together. At the trial, their lawyers argued that another drug dealer was responsible for the quadruple murder. They claimed that the drug dealer did it as revenge for a drug deal that went wrong. The jury ended up acquitting both Nash and Dials. Gregory Dials died 6 years later, in January 1997, from liver failure. 9 years after the acquittal, in May 2000, the district attorney announced that they were charging Eddie Nash with several crimes. This included running a cocaine and heroin distribution syndicate, laundering money, tax fraud, and tampering with a jury and witnesses. When Nash went to trial for the murders the first time, there was one holdout on the jury who voted to acquit. The juror who voted to acquit was an 18-year-old woman. Because she refused to convict, it led to a deadlocked jury, which resulted in a mistrial. The district attorney said that they had evidence that Nash had bribed the juror with $50,000. In September 2001, Nash, who was 72, pleaded guilty to 1 count of money laundering and 1 count of wire fraud. He also admitted to bribing the juror at his murder trial, but the statute of limitations had run out on that crime. Nash was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison, and he was fined $250,000. Eddie Nash died in August 2014 at the age of 85. Number 3. Laszlo Bazormania. In early 1981, 24-year-old Navy intelligence specialist Laszlo Bazormania was assigned to the USS Constellation. At the end of January, the ship was docked in San Diego, California. Bazormania had just completed an intelligence mission where he looked at satellite and airplane surveillance photographs of an area of Iran where helicopters planned to land to rescue hostages during the Iran hostage crisis. The mission was called Operation Eagle Claw. The mission ultimately failed, and 8 American servicemen were killed. After the USS Constellation docked, Bazormania disembarked to attend an intelligence class in Omaha, Nebraska. Bazormania decided to drive his yellow and white Volkswagen van the 1,600 miles from San Diego to Omaha. Along the way, he planned to do some skiing. On January 29th, Bazormania was found shot to death near Kremlin, Colorado. His van was parked in a place that was visible to a nearby highway, and his body had been dragged behind the van to hide it from people driving by. He had been shot once in the back of the head with a .22 caliber rifle. The Naval Investigative Service, which is now known as the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, or NCIS, had an agent investigate the murder. A month after the murder, the Naval Investigative Service gave their report to the local sheriff's department. The report said that the motive for Bazormania's murder was robbery. Shortly before Bazormania was killed, he had cashed his paycheck, which was about $1,000, and the money was missing from his van. The report said that someone was hanging out with him, they drank some beers, that person saw his money, and then chose to rob him. Several witnesses said that they saw a green Jeep parked behind Borzomenya's van for 2 hours on the afternoon that his body was found. However, Borzomenya's sister and several people who served with him found the investigation into his murder and their findings to be rather odd. The first thing that they point out is that when something unusual happens to an intelligence officer, like when he or she is killed, there is usually a large investigation. The investigation of Borzomenya's murder was small and not very fruitful. No suspects or persons of interest were ever identified, and the murder weapon was never found. Another problem was that the report said that 2 of Borzomenya's superiors were interviewed by the Naval Investigative Service regarding his murder. But the 2 men named in the report claimed that they were never interviewed by the Naval Investigative Service about Borzomenya's murder. In fact, no one who served with Borzomenya said that they were interviewed. The odd way that the Naval Investigative Service handled the case has led to some speculation that Borzomenya's murder may be connected to espionage. One theory is that Borzomenya was selling Navy intelligence and he was killed over it. However, his family and the people who served with him said that scenario seems incredibly unlikely. Another way that Borzomenya's murder could be connected to espionage revolves around the fact that his parents came to the United States from Hungary, which was part of the Eastern Bloc at the time of his murder. His parents had relationships with people back in Hungary, and they may have unwittingly mentioned that their son was an intelligence officer with the Navy. Then the information that Borzomenya was an intelligence officer somehow got passed on to someone in the intelligence community in the Eastern Bloc. Agents working for the Eastern Bloc tracked Borzomenya down, and they extracted, or they tried to extract, information from him, leading to his death. One of Borzomenya's intelligence supervisors said that it seems unlikely that he was killed for intelligence reasons. He points out that when Borzomenya was killed, he was in between missions, so he wasn't privy to anything too top secret when he was killed. Also, he doesn't think that foreign agents would have tracked Borzomenya from San Diego to Colorado only to kill him in a place where several people saw their truck. It would have just been easier for foreign agents to attack or kidnap him in San Diego, and trained spies would have made sure there were no witnesses. However, the supervisor said that the possibility that Borzomenya was killed because of his work in intelligence could not be excluded. In 2008, the Sheriff's Department was hoping to create a DNA profile of the killer from beer bottles found near the crime scene, but the results were inconclusive. Over 37 years later, the identity of Laszlo Borzomenya's killer and why he was killed are still mysteries. Number 2. Laetitia Thoreau. At 6 p.m. on May 16, 1937, 29-year-old Laetitia Thoreau left a dance hall that was located in a seedy neighborhood of Paris, France. Shortly after leaving, she caught a bus to the metro. The platform of the metro was busy, but Thoreau was the only passenger with a first-class ticket. When the train arrived, many people saw her board the empty first-class carriage alone. The train left the station, and about 45 seconds later, it pulled into the next station. At that station, no one exited the first-class carriage. 6 people boarded the first-class carriage, and they found Thoreau dead, with a dagger buried to the heath in her neck. The police were alerted, and officers arrived shortly afterwards to investigate the first murder on the metro. She had been stabbed once with a 7-inch long knife, and the stab cut her jugular. The doctor that examined the body thought that the stab was so expertly done that the killer was probably a professional assassin. The police and the press agreed with the doctor's conclusion. The killer managed to slip onto the carriage without being seen. He expertly stabbed Theroux and then got off the carriage before it arrived at the next station 45 seconds later. The police called it the perfect murder. What no one could figure out was why Theroux, who was a 29-year-old Italian immigrant that worked in a glue factory, was the target of a professional hit. The police learned that Theroux had been married for 6 years, but the marriage was a secret. Her husband was from a high society family, and Theroux was from a working class family. Her husband died in 1934, and it was only on his deathbed that he told his family that he was married to Theroux. After his death, his family severed all ties with Theroux. In her spare time, Theroux frequented dance halls in Paris that had less than stellar reputations. The police interviewed over 800 people in connection with her murder. No one at the dance hall, on the bus, or on the metro saw anything suspicious on the night of the murder. 6 months after the murder, the case took an unusual turn. In November 1937, the police exposed the Secret Committee of Revolutionary Action, or better known as the Cagoule, or the Hooded Ones. They were a secret society made up of some of the upper echelon of French society. They were bankrolled by the heads of some of the biggest businesses in France, like the cosmetic company L'Oreal and Michelin, the tire company. The Cagoule was a far-right, fascist-leaning, anti-communist group, and they were responsible for a series of violent acts starting in 1936. Their ultimate plan was to overthrow the socialist government of France in a paramilitary coup and then install a dictator. During their reign of terror, the Cagoule murdered at least 7 people, and they were responsible for 2 bombings. The 2 bombings occurred on the same day. They both happened on September 11, 1937, in an upscale neighborhood of Paris. The bombings were made to look like they were the work of communists that were intent on overthrowing the government. Besides planting bombs and killing people, the Cagoule also smuggled guns, amassed weapons, formed militias, and built secret underground prisons. After the group was exposed, several members of the Cagoule said that they had information on the murder of Laetitia Theroux. They said that Theroux had been dating the Cagoule's gun smuggling expert, Gabriel Jantet. Supposedly, Theroux had been going to the police in Paris with information on the group's gun running activities, and she also apparently had been making secretive visits to the Italian embassy. Members of the Cagoule began to suspect that Theroux was working as a secret agent. So they fed her some information about a car that was supposedly carrying guns from Switzerland into France. The car was stopped along its route and searched. The authorities didn't find any guns in the car. This was proof to the members of the Cagoule that Theroux was leaking information, so they ordered her to be killed. The strongest suspect for who physically killed Theroux was Jean Filot, who was one of the founding members of the Cagoule. After the group was exposed, he fled to Spain. He was convicted of 3 of the Cagoule's murders in absentia, and he was sentenced to death. However, he was never executed. He stayed in Spain, and it was rumored that he worked for L'Oreal, while other reports say that he lived off blackmail money. In September 1939, World War II started, and in May 1940, Germany invaded France. The war made finding Theroux's killer much less of a priority for the people of France, and eventually, it was forgotten. The police files on Theroux's case apparently contained sensitive information regarding members of some of France's most prominent families. The files were ultimately sealed by the French government for 101 years. That means they won't be made public until 2038, so it may be another 30 years before the identity of Letitia Thoreau's killer is finally revealed. Number 1. Yosef Alon. Yosef Alon was born in Palestine in July 1929, and when he was 2, he moved with his parents back to their native Czechoslovakia. In 1939, as World War II loomed, 10-year-old Alon was sent to England. Sadly, he lost most of his family in the Holocaust. After the creation of Israel in 1948, Alon immigrated there, and he became one of their first fighter pilots. He completed 75 missions, and he reached the rank of colonel. In 1973, he was working as a diplomat in the United States. In June of that year, he was nearing the end of a 3-year stint as the Assistant Military Naval Attaché at the Israeli Embassy in Washington, and he was living in Chevy Chase, Maryland. On the last day of June, Alon and his wife attended a party for a staffer at the embassy. They returned home at around 12:30. When they got home, his wife walked into the house while Alon grabbed his jacket out of the back seat of the car. Suddenly, his wife heard a barrage of gunshots. After the gunshots stopped, she looked outside and saw a white car speeding away. She rushed to Alon's side and found him bleeding from the abdomen. Alon's wife and his 18-year-old daughter tried to slow the bleeding with towels while they waited for the ambulance. Alon was rushed to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead within the hour. He had been shot 5 times, including one shot directly to the heart. The gun was a .38 caliber revolver that was foreign made. The FBI took over the investigation and decided to explore the common reasons people are murdered, like a robbery, a love triangle, or over some type of debt. They soon ruled out those motives and concluded that he had probably been assassinated by Arab terrorists. Specifically, they thought it might have been the work of Black September. Black September was a terrorist organization that was started in 1971 as an offshoot of the Palestinian Liberation Army, which is known by its acronym, the PLO. Black September is best known for killing the Prime Minister of Jordan in 1971 and for committing the Munich massacre, which is where 11 Israeli Olympic athletes and officials were killed during the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, Germany. In the wake of the Munich massacre, the Israeli Prime Minister and the Israeli Defense Committee gave the Mossad, which is the Israeli Secret Service, authorization to track down and kill the individuals involved in plotting the massacre. This included both members of Black September and the PLO. When Mossad agents started killing off their targets, the PLO retaliated by hunting down Mossad operatives and killing them. The tit-for-tat assassinations between the Mossad and the PLO was called a War of Spooks. This War of Spooks was depicted in the 2005 Steven Spielberg movie, Munich. On the day of Alon's murder, the Voice of Palestine, which was a Palestinian radio station that broadcasted out of Cairo, Egypt, announced that Alon had been executed as revenge for the death of Mohammed Boudia. Boudia was a high-ranking member of Black September, and he was killed 2 days before Alon was gunned down. Boudia was killed by a Mossad-planted car bomb in Paris. The FBI put a lot of resources and manpower into finding Alon's killer, but they couldn't turn up a single suspect or the murder weapon. The FBI also couldn't find any evidence that anyone affiliated with the PLO was involved in the shooting. They found no evidence of anyone with links to the PLO coming into the United States around the time of the murder and staying in a hotel or renting a car in the area of the shooting. So if Alon was killed on the orders of the PLO, where did the shooter come from? Although the case was unresolved and there were no suspects, the FBI closed Alon's case in 1976. In 1977, all the physical evidence in the case was destroyed. Then in 2007, over 30 years after Alon was killed, the Associated Press published a story about Alon's murder. The reporters who wrote the story obtained 7,000 pages on the case from the FBI through the Freedom of Information Act. They learned that a year after the case was closed, the FBI received a tip from the CIA. Apparently, Alon was killed by a two-man team that consisted of a driver and a shooter. The two men had entered the United States through Canada using Lebanese or Cypriot passports. They went to Washington, D.C., where they stayed with friends who were attending a local college. In Washington, the two men apparently met up with a professor who helped them set up the assassination. They used a rented car for the shooting and then drove a second rented car to Dulles International Airport. They took a domestic flight to the West Coast before flying to somewhere in the Middle East. The FBI investigated the tip, and again, they found nothing. After the article on Alon's murder was published, Fred Burton, a former State Department counterterrorism agent, began to look into the case. In his book that was published in 2011, Burton asserts that Alon was more than just a diplomat. He was an intelligence officer. He says that Alon was cultivating a mole inside of Black September, and that is why he was killed. Supposedly, the shooter was a PLO foot soldier. After killing Alon, the shooter fled to Brazil before going to Lebanon. Burns says that he asked his contacts in the Israeli intelligence community if they knew what happened to the shooter once he got to Lebanon. Burns says that he got a message back saying that the matter had been resolved. Apparently, the assassin was killed by the Mossad in 2011. However, Burton's claims have never been verified. Also, his version of events contradict two other theories on who killed Alon. The first theory comes from one of the FBI agents who originally worked on the case. He said that a year into the investigation, he was told by another FBI agent, who is now dead, not to work too hard on the case because the Mossad had already taken care of the problem. That means the assassin was dead 37 years before Burton claims that he was killed. Just like Fred Burton's claims, the FBI agent's claims have not been verified. Fred Burton wasn't the only person whose intrigue was ignited after the article on Alon's murder was published in 2007. After the article was released, one of its authors sent a copy to Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, who is better known as Carlos the Jackal. Sanchez was born in Venezuela, and as an adult, he joined the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a faction of the PLO. During the 1970s and 80s, he was the most wanted terrorist in the world. In 1992, Sanchez was convicted in absentia in France for killing two French secret agents that tried to arrest him in 1975. Around the same time that he was convicted, Sanchez moved to the Sudan, which didn't have an extradition treaty with France. In August 1994, French Secret Service agents sedated and kidnapped Sanchez in the Sudan and brought him back to France, where he was retried for the murders that he was convicted of in absentia. He was found guilty and he was sentenced to life without parole. He has since been given 2 other life sentences for terrorist acts that he committed. After reading the article, Sanchez wrote back to the author, and in his letter, he said that he knew who carried out the hit on Alon. The FBI learned that Sanchez possibly had information on Alon's murder, so they sent Special Agent Eugene Casey to France to interview Sanchez. In a series of interviews, Sanchez told Casey everything he knew about the killing of Alon. He said that in the early 1970s, There were 3 Americans who were Vietnam veterans that hung out at a bookstore in Paris that was owned by a Palestinian man. The 3 Americans told the bookstore owner that they were sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and they wanted to make a statement for them. The owner of the bookstore got them in touch with a member of Black September. The Black September member told the 3 Americans that if they wanted to do something to help the Palestinian cause, they could kill Yosef Alon. Black September and the PLO didn't expect the Americans to follow through, and they were surprised and happy when they discovered that Alon had been killed. If Alon's killers were American, this would explain why there was no evidence of anyone with links to the PLO being in the area at the time of his murder. Special Agent Casey investigated the information that Sanchez gave him, and he was able to verify some of the information. This included the fact that there was once a bookstore at the address in Paris that Sanchez gave him. The bookstore was owned by a Palestinian activist who was shot to death in 1977. Sanchez also gave Casey the names of the 3 Americans. Casey discovered that they were real people. One was dead, but the other 2 were alive. Casey interviewed the 2 living men. One of the men used to be a prominent member of the Black Panthers. He said he was in Paris in the early 1970s, but he said he didn't know anything about Yosef Alon. The other man, who lived in Chicago, said he didn't know anything about the murdered diplomat either. Both Special Agent Casey and Alon's family are hoping that one day soon, the case will be solved. Number 3. Trayvon Wynn. In April 2011, 24-year-old Trayvon Wynn was visiting relatives in Brooklyn, New York. Wynn lived in Rock Hill, South Carolina. He had a 16-month-old daughter, and his girlfriend was pregnant with his second child. On the evening of April 23, 2011, Wynn was standing outside his uncle's chicken restaurant in the Flatbush neighborhood of Brooklyn. He was waiting for a ride from his cousin, who was in the restaurant. As he waited, he chatted on his cell phone. A man dressed in black wearing a hood walked by Wynn. He looked at Wynn as he entered the restaurant. In the restaurant, he seems to adjust an object in his waistband, and then he puts the object into a pocket in his jacket. Moments later, he stepped back out of the restaurant and appeared to walk away. But then he circled back, pulled out a handgun, and shot Wynn twice in the chest. The man then ran away. Wynn dropped to the ground and struggled to stand. 24-year-old Trayvon Wynn was taken to the hospital and was pronounced dead an hour after he was shot. The killer has never been identified. Beyond the murder itself, what disturbed Wynn's family and some of the people in the police department was what happened after he was shot. A crowd gathered around him, but no one helped him or even kneeled to comfort him. They just watched him bleed to death on the sidewalk. One man snapped a photo of the dying man on his phone. Some members of Wynn's family believe the murder was a case of mistaken identity. They said he had not been in Brooklyn long enough to make an enemy who would want to kill him. The night before his murder, one of Wynn's cousins had been involved in a physical altercation. They think the relative was the real target. Wynn's mother was told that a witness had heard the gunman say he shot the wrong person. However, Wynn's girlfriend believes he was the target. She pointed out he had a tendency to get into trouble. He had a criminal record which included convictions for assault and weapons possession. He had served time in prison, and while he was serving his sentence, he was caught with contraband. She thinks that the short time Wynn was in Brooklyn, he made an enemy. She pointed out that the killer looked him in the face before he shot him. It's been 14 years since 24-year-old Trayvon Wynn was shot to death. His case is considered cold. Number 2. Silvano Oblida's Quintero Tolentino. On January 26, 2021, 19-year-old Silvano Oblida's Quintero Tolentino left his home in Huánuco, Peru. He was heading to Medellin, Colombia, with two men he had recently met. Oblidas planned to buy clothes and then return to Lima to sell them. But about 2 weeks after he left, Oblidas contacted his family. He said the two men he traveled with stole all his money, which was about $1,300 US. He contacted his sister using WhatsApp and asked her to send some money so he could get home. It was during the COVID-19 pandemic, and because of lockdown rules, she couldn't transfer the money to him until the next day. But his family never heard from him again. 4 days after they last heard from him, on February 14, 2021, a neighbor of Oblida's sent his family a video that had been uploaded to TikTok and was going viral. The neighbor believed that Oblidas was in the video. It was a disturbing video recorded on a cell phone. Oblida's family instantly recognized him when they saw him in the video. He was standing on a bridge and he was being questioned by two men about where he was from. The two men appear to be strangers to Oblidas, and they are not the men who swindled him. Oblidas replied, quote, "From Huánuco, Peru," unquote. Then suddenly the man who was recording picked up Oblidas by the legs and flipped him over the bridge's guardrail. The footage is choppy, but it follows Oblidas falling over 100 feet, and then there's a loud bang. One of the men says, quote, "Erase that, he's dead," unquote. TikTok took the video down hours after it went live. Oblida's family went to the police. The local police contacted the police in Medellin and they recovered the body. The police said they believe they know who killed the teenager, but they have not been able to find them. It's been over 4 years since the murder of 19-year-old Silvano Oblida's Quintero Tolentino, and no arrests have been made. His family is still hoping to get justice for his brutal, shocking, and senseless murder. Number 1. Liz Barraza. In early 2019, Elizabeth Barraza, who went by Liz, and her husband, Sergio Barraza, had been married for nearly 5 years. They lived in Tomball, a city in the Houston metropolitan area. Liz was a data reporter for a pipeline inspection company, while Sergio worked for his father's flooring business. The couple did not have any children. Liz was obsessed with Star Wars and Harry Potter. For the couple's 5th wedding anniversary, they planned on visiting Universal Studios and Disney World in Orlando, Florida. Liz was very excited to visit the wizarding world of Harry Potter at Universal. The couple was planning on leaving January 26, 2018. On the night of January 24th, Liz and Sergio decided to do a yard sale the next morning to earn some extra money for the trip. They put up signs around the neighborhood, but they didn't post anything about the sale on their social media accounts. Between 6:15 and 6:45 on the morning of January 25, 2018, Liz and Sergio started setting up the yard sale. At 6:48 a.m., Sergio left work, leaving Liz alone to work at the yard sale. 4 minutes later, a neighbor called 911 because he had heard 4 gunshots. The police arrived in the area and they found Liz bleeding from 4 gunshot wounds. She was taken to the hospital. Her family decided to donate her organs. 29-year-old Liz Barraza died 4 days after she was shot. The police got the footage from several doorbell cameras in the neighborhood, and they pieced together what happened that morning. Around 2 a.m., someone in a black Nissan Frontier is seen driving around the neighborhood. The truck returned to the neighborhood at 6:48 a.m. and parked on a street. At the same time, Sergio left for work. The truck is seen 3 minutes later heading to the couple's home. After pulling a U-turn, the driver parked behind Liz's car. The killer then walks up to Liz, who is still setting up. At 6:52 a.m., Liz said good morning to the killer, and the killer said something to her. Then the killer pulled out a revolver and shot 20-year-old Liz 3 times in the torso. After she fell to the ground, the killer shot her once more in the face. This gunshot was fatal. The killer then ran to their truck and drove away. 3 minutes later, the killer drove out of the couple's subdivision, but then did a U-turn and immediately re-entered the subdivision. The killer then drove back past Liz's home again. The pickup truck was recorded several more times in the neighborhood. It's unknown when the killer drove out of the neighborhood, or if they did drive out of the neighborhood. Unfortunately, none of the cameras recorded the license plate of the black Nissan Frontier. Also, while the murder was recorded on a neighbor's doorbell camera, there was no clear footage of the killer. It's not known if it was a man or a woman. They appear to have long hair, but they may have been wearing a wig. There's some speculation that the killer was wearing a disguise. But the video is grainy, so it's hard to make any definitive conclusions about the killer's appearance. The police investigated many possible motives, but they did not find anyone who would want to kill Liz Barraza. Liz and Sergio did not have any enemies. They liked to cosplay and to dress up and go to Renaissance fairs. Liz was a kind and generous woman who volunteered at charities. The police also noted that Liz does not seem nervous or scared when she encounters the killer. Liz's father believes it was a contract killing because of how professional the killer was. For example, the murderer used a revolver so that the shells wouldn't be left behind. Also, the killer took the time to shoot her in the face after shooting her 3 times in the chest, ensuring she was dead. The killer did not steal anything. They simply walked up to Liz, shot her to death, and ran away. The entire crime was about 30 seconds. Sergio says he knows that many people believe he is responsible for his wife's murder. People find it suspicious that she was killed minutes after he left for work. However, Sergio maintains he had nothing to do with his wife's murder. He says he has fully cooperated with the investigation and has taken a polygraph exam. He says that he passed the polygraph. Sergio says he has no idea who murdered his wife of 5 years or why she was killed. He said that it appears that Liz was targeted and the killer knew they could find her setting out for the yard sale. But Sergio does not think that many people knew about the yard sale. They had only decided to do it the night before the murder, and they put up signs that night. They did not post about it on social media. A year and a half after the murder, Sergio met a woman named Amber, and they later got married. The police have said they have not eliminated anyone as a suspect. Sergio and Liz's family hopes that her case will be solved soon. Number 3. The Italian Unabomber. Porto Vecchio is a small hamlet in Corsica, Italy. On December 8, 1993, a telephone booth exploded in the hamlet. Luckily, no one was injured. Little did anyone know, but this was the start of a prolific campaign of terror that would go on for years. Months later, on August 21, 1994, a songbird festival was being held in the small town of Sicily. A woman found a foot-long pipe bomb hidden in a hydrangea bush. Not realizing it was a bomb, she picked it up. The bomb was packed with glass marbles. It exploded and injured her and her 2 children. They all survived. On March 5, 1995, there was a Carnival festival in Asciano Decimo. A woman was injured by shards of glass from the storefront. The next day, another bomb went off in a churchyard in Aviano after a religious ceremony. No one was hurt in that blast. At this point, the police began to think that one person or a group of people was responsible for the bombings. but they didn't have any suspects and the bombings continued. On March 5, 1995, there was a Carnival festival in Aziano Decimo. 2 pipe bombs exploded 100 yards apart from each other. Once again, no one was hurt. Pordenone was the site of the 3rd bombing, and on September 30th, 1995, it was targeted again. A woman named Anna Pigno found an iron pipe by a garbage can and she picked it up. It exploded. She was rushed to the hospital and survived, but she lost one of her arms. It was the first time a bomb seriously injured someone. That same day in Pordenone, a second pipe bomb was found and taken home by a woman. The next day, she learned about the other pipe bomb and called the police. The police gave the bomb to the military, who blew it up. The bomber didn't strike again until December 11, 1995. In Aquileia, a telephone booth was blown up. On Christmas Eve, another phone booth was blown up in La Sagna. On the day after Christmas, a bomb exploded in the seaside resort of Bibione. In the last 3 bombings, no one was injured or killed. On April 2, 1996, there was a small explosion in Clout. Once again, there were no injuries. 20 days later, there was another bombing in Benia, where no one was hurt or killed. On August 4, 1996, around 6 a.m., a lifeguard at a beach in Bibione found a 20-centimeter tube on the beach. He opened one end and it exploded. He was slightly injured. A few hours later, on the same beach, Roberto Curcio picked up a piece of an umbrella shaft. It turned out to be a bomb, and it exploded in his hand. His hand was badly hurt, and his femoral artery was severed. He was rushed to the hospital, and he survived. At this point, the police knew that all the bombs were planted in the northeast part of Italy, so they believed that is where the bomber lived. But otherwise, at that point, they had no clues to his identity. The bomber then went on a hiatus. A bomb was found in a restaurant in February 1998. It did not detonate. The police are not convinced that this was the work of the same perpetrator. It's generally believed that he was inactive between August 1996 and March 2000. When the Italian Unabomber restarted his campaign of terror, he shifted away from using pipe bombs. Instead, he began hiding explosives and harmless objects that would often attract children. On March 6, 2000, in San Vito al Tagliamento, a bomb was found inside a can of silly string during an outdoor festival. Luckily, it did not detonate. Months later, on July 6, a man found a pipe bomb on a beach in Legnano Sabodoro. It exploded and he suffered facial injuries. On September 13th, a woman was injured by a bomb while harvesting a vineyard in San Stito della Vinzia. On Halloween 2000, a man bought some eggs from a supermarket in Portoguerrero. He noticed something odd in the carton. It appeared to be wires, so he called the police. They found a small bomb inside an eggshell. The bomber had hard-boiled the egg and emptied the shell. He then put the device in the shell and placed it in the carton. A week later, on November 7th, a woman at the same grocery store picked up a tube of tomato paste and it exploded in her hand. Her hand was badly injured, but she survived. The police searched the store but didn't find any more bombs. But they missed a bomb hidden in a jar of mayo. A woman purchased it. But when her husband, who was in the military, handled it, he noticed something was off with it, so he handed it over to the police. Luckily, no one was hurt. On November 1st, 2000, the day after the first bomb was found in the supermarket, a bomb was found in the same vineyard in Centino della Vinzia that a bomb was found a month and a half earlier. This bomb did not go off. After that, the bomber went quiet again. Then a year later, on November 2nd, 2001, in Motta della Vinzia, a woman picked up an electric candle on a grave at a cemetery. It exploded and the woman was injured, but survived. On July 23, 2002, a woman bought a jar of Nutella from a supermarket in Borsia. As she was opening it, she heard strange sounds and fumes emanated from it. She threw the jar out of her house and called the police. Over a month later, on September 2nd, a 5-year-old boy and his mother purchased a tube of bubbles in Pordenone. Inside was a small bomb. It exploded, and the boy was injured, but not too severely. At the midnight mass, shortly after it began, a pipe bomb detonated in a confession stall in a church in Cornones. No one was hurt. The bomber waited 3 months before he struck again. On March 24, 2003, a bomb went off in a toilet house in a courthouse in Pordenone. It went off near the office of a prosecutor who was investigating the bomber. A month later, on April 25, 2003, a 9-year-old girl who was camping with her family in Forage della Battaglia found a highlighter. It turned out to be a bomb. It exploded and she was seriously injured, but she survived. On April 2, 2004, a cleaner at a church in Portoguerrero was getting ready for Easter services. Inside a pillow for kneeling, they found out what turned out to be a bomb. It was meant to detonate when someone kneeled on the pillow. The police were called and no one was hurt. The bomber struck up again on January 26, 2004. He hid a bomb in a Kinder Surprise egg and left it in a telephone booth near the Treviso courthouse. A 12-year-old boy found it and threw it. It exploded and no one was injured. Months later, on March 13th, at a church in Moda de Lavinzia, a 6-year-old girl and a woman turned on an electric candle. It exploded. The girl was badly injured and the woman was hurt, but not too severely. They both survived. 3 days later, an undetonated bomb was found in Romania. It had been in a humanitarian supply box that was sent from a church in the village of Concordia Sagittaria. It's believed it was sent to Romania a year earlier. On July 9, 2005, a woman was riding her bike in Portoguerrero. Suddenly, something fell off the bottom of her seat. It turned out to be a bomb that had stopped working. The bike had been parked at a train station for a week and was kept in her backyard for 3 more days. The bomb stopped working because it was damaged by rainwater. The bomber stopped again for the rest of the year. Then on March 6, 2006, a couple who was walking on a beach in Porto Santa Margherita found a bottle in the sand. They thought there was a message in the bottle, so they opened it and it exploded. Both the man and the woman were injured, but not killed. After that, the bomber went quiet, and it's believed he stayed quiet since then. Between July 1993 and May 2006, there were over 30 bombings. No one was killed. The police do have clues about the bomber's identity. For example, from the bomb hidden in the eggs, they have a strand of hair and his DNA. They also found a partial fingerprint on one of the bombs. An arrest was even made in the case. In August 2006, 49-year-old aeronautical engineer Elvio Zornida was arrested. Zornida lived in the same area where many of the bombs were planted. He also had a workshop in his home that contained all the materials needed to make the bombs. He was also fascinated with explosives. The problem was that none of the physical evidence linked him to the bombings. In fact, it turned out that one of the police officers had tampered with the evidence to try to connect him with the bombings. In January 2009, a judge officially exonerated Zornida. He was awarded 300,000 euros. The police officer who tampered with the evidence was sentenced to 2 years in prison. At the time of this video, the police are still investigating the case. There have been no bombs since May 2006, and the people of Italy are hoping that the bomber has officially retired. Number 2. The South County Car Bomber. St. Louis is one of the 2 largest cities in Missouri and is best known for beer, baseball, and the Blues hockey team. In 1977, it was home to a series of deadly unsolved car bombings. 23-year-old Ronald Stragos lived in an apartment close to the Mississippi River. On the morning of October 7, 1977, Stragos left his apartment to go to his job at the Monsanto Company plant, where he worked as an engineer. As soon as he turned on the ignition, his car exploded. A bomb had been planted under the seat. Because the explosion was small, Stragos wasn't severely injured. 11 days later, Robert Curtis Jackson, 39, encountered a similar fate. Jackson worked for UPS. He left his apartment on October 18th to drive to Union, Missouri, where he was to do training on driver and plant safety. As soon as Jackson started his car, a bomb went off. Jackson died instantly. A bomb had been planted under his seat and wired to the ignition. The bombing seemed to stop until November 3rd. That morning, 33-year-old computer analyst Shirley Marie Flynn left her home to go to work. She started her car, and a bomb composed of 3 dynamite sticks that had been planted under her seat exploded. Flynn was killed instantly. Like the other bombs, the bomb had been wired to the ignition. The blast was so powerful that it blew her body into the back of the car. Her windshield was thrown onto the roof of an adjoining apartment building. The police were baffled by the bombings. The police found no connection between Stragos, Jackson, and Flynn. Friends and family of each victim said they had no known enemies. The police performed an extensive investigation and concluded that the victims were chosen randomly. The bomber then went quiet. Then nearly a year and a half later, on March 7, 1978, a car bomb exploded in Paducah, Kentucky. Paducah is about 175 miles from St. Louis. The bomb was planted in the car of William Olhausen. His hip, stomach, and legs were severely injured, but he survived. While the bomb went off in a different state, the police saw a connection between that bombing and the 3 St. Louis bombings. That's because the target was Shirley Flynn's boyfriend. When she was killed, they were living together in St. Louis. Olhausen was in Paducah on a business trip and staying at the Best Western Motel. Like in Flynn and Jackson's cases, the bomb was planted under the seat. When the bomb went off, Olhausen was launched into the ceiling of the vehicle. At the time, Olhausen was wearing a hard hat. The police believe that his 9-inch thick seat and a hard hat protected Olsen from being killed. Except for the Kentucky bombing, the first 3 bombings occurred within 3 miles. The police did develop a suspect, 41-year-old John Steincotter. Steincotter and Olhausen formerly worked together at the St. Louis Ship Company. Steincotter was fired and strongly believed Olhausen had something to do with it. But when Olhausen's car exploded, Steincotter was in jail after allegedly planting a homemade bomb in his mother-in-law's home in Paducah. Steincotter's wife, Leanne, did not know Steincotter's whereabouts on the days of the St. Louis bombings. She also noted that he took great care removing his fingerprints from the bomb he placed in her mother's home using lighter fluid. Steincotter took a lie detector test and passed, so the police dropped him as a suspect. Aside from the police determining that the culprit had extensive knowledge of munitions and electrical systems, they could not determine a motive. At the time of this video, the case is considered cold. Number 1. The Zip Gun Bomber. On May 7, 1982, Joan Betty Kipp, a 54-year-old high school guidance counselor who lived in New York City, was looking through her mail. There was a package addressed to her, and inside of it was a Sears cookbook. She thought it was a Mother's Day gift, but the cookbook was rigged with a homemade zip gun. It was electrically charged and set to fire 3 .22 caliber bullets in 2 directions. When she opened the cookbook, the bomb detonated. One of the bullets hit the wall, and the other 2 struck Joan in the chest. Shrapnel injured her face and hands badly. Joan's husband, Harold, was outside when the device went off. He ran inside and found Joan conscious. She said, "Look what they did to me. There may be others." Joan was rushed to the hospital, but died on the operating table. The police examined the remains of the package, the cookbook, and the bomb. The culprit had written a note in the cookbook. It read, "Dear Joan, you're dead." The note also threatened the rest of Joan's family, including her 31-year-old daughter, Doreen. The bomb used a pair of 6-volt D batteries. The barrels for the bullets were used as part of a car's brake line. The triggering mechanism was a screw inside a ballpoint pen. The device was loaded with 3 .22 caliber bullets. It was packed with double the amount of gunpowder needed to fire the bullets. This is what caused the shrapnel to fly out from the device. Joan's husband, Harold, cooperated with the police. He handed over Joan's diary and allowed them to access his business without a search warrant. A handwriting analyst looked at the threatening note and theorized that the writing belonged to Joan and Harold's 28-year-old son, Craig Hipp. A special dog allegedly picked up Craig's scent on the package. Craig was arrested and charged with Joan's murder 3 months after her death. The police determined his motive was a rocky parent-child relationship. Harold maintained that his son was innocent and there was no animosity between Joan and Craig. The charges against Craig were later dropped. The statements from the handwriting analyst and the dog trainer were not credible enough to prove that Craig was behind the murder. After that, the case went cold. 11 years went by without any progress made on the case. In October 1993, Anthony Lenza, a retired New York sanitation worker who lived on Staten Island, and his wife were on vacation in Pennsylvania. Their children came to visit them and brought the mail from their home. One piece of mail was a large parcel. Inside of it was a blue velvet coin box. When Lenza opened the box, it detonated. In the explosion, Lenza and 2 of his family members were hit. This included his 11-year-old granddaughter. They all survived their injuries. The police examined the package and the box it came in. It was just like the bomb that killed Joan Kemp 11 years earlier. The typeface on the package was also similar. Once again, there were no arrests. The police could not find any connection between Lenza and Joan, and they weren't sure why they were targeted. The culprit struck again in Brooklyn, New York, about 6 months later. On April 5, 1994, 75-year-old Alice Caswell received a similar package addressed to her brother, Robert McCarroll. Her brother had lived with her but moved years earlier. Caswell opened the package. Inside was a coin box. When she opened the box, the device fired a .22 caliber bullet into her stomach. She made it to her neighbor's home and 911 was called. She survived the incident. The police now had a pattern with the devices, but still no motive or suspect. By now, the media began referring to the creator of these deadly devices as the zip gun bomber. In June 1995, 18-year-old Stephanie Gaffney lived in Queens, New York with her grandfather, Detective Irving Gilmore. She was 8.5 months pregnant. Her grandfather, Irving, was a retired detective who was currently working as a private detective. Her uncle, James Gilmore, was also a detective. He worked in the anti-gang unit. On June 27th, a package addressed to Gilmore, our occupant, arrived at the house. Inside of it was a hardcover book. Stephanie opened it and it exploded. She was rushed to the hospital. Once again, the device had been equipped with 3 .22 caliber bullets. None of them hit Stephanie, but she was struck with shrapnel. She was taken to the hospital and induced to give labor. Both she and her baby survived. The police concluded that the bomb came from the same bomber, but they didn't find any more clues to identify the zip gun bomber. With this bomb, they weren't even sure who the intended victim was, but the police did develop a suspect when investigating an unrelated case. His name is Steve Wavera. They connected him to Joan Hipp, the first victim, and the only person who died. Wavera was once a student at Dyker Heights Junior High, where Joan was a guidance counselor. Wavera said he had no ill feelings towards Joan, despite being held back twice. Wavera served in the Navy from 1972 to 1973. During his time in the service, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Wavera had his fair share of trouble in adult life, spending most of it in prison. His offenses included criminal possession of poisonous liquid, making bomb threats to postal facilities, and assaulting a military police officer. While the police were investigating Wavera's roommate on an unrelated case, they found hollowed-out books and bomb-making equipment in their apartment. Wavera claimed that the stuff belonged to him and not his roommate. He said he was using it, or was yet to use it, in another crime, though not through the mail, but on a U.S. military base. Wavera also had 4 .22 caliber rifle shells as well. But the police had a problem. When Joan was killed, Wavera was in prison. The police theorized that Wavera had his roommate assist him. However, it was only a theory and the police didn't have enough to arrest Wavera. A year passed and there were no more bombs. Richard and Marietta Basile, who were in their late 70s, were retired real estate agents and they lived in Brooklyn. On June 20th, 1996, Richard was going through the mail and found a package addressed to Marietta. In the package was a video cassette. Moments after he opened it, the zip gun inside the cassette detonated. The bullets barely missed the couple and they received minor injuries. After that, the zip gun bomber stopped his campaign of terror. Between 1982 and 1996, 5 bombs were sent to people in New York City. 1 person was killed and 7 were injured. No one was ever convicted in connection with the bombings. Steve Wavera was released from jail in 2005 and his current whereabouts are unknown. At the time of this video, the zip gun bomber remains unidentified.